everyone. It is now 12:05. Thank you, Enrique. I just wanted to start off by saying thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to see all of these new and familiar faces. On behalf of the Williams-Boston Alumni Association, I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all for signing up for this event and let you know that we do have a plethora of fun things in store, so stay tuned. So that you know, today's session is going to be recorded and there will be time for questions at the end, which you will be able to put into the chat at that moment. I also wanted to take a moment to say that if you do have suggestions for future events, or if you want to host yourself, feel free to reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat, although I'm sure a lot of you have already received many emails from me. The WBA board does meet once a month, so if you're interested in joining us, please don't hesitate to let me know and I will get you looped in. Without further ado, I wanted to give a quick thank you to Rob at Alumni Relations and our EAFS in Boston president, Ari, for helping us set this event up. It wouldn't have been possible without them. And I wanted to say an extra special thank you to our host today, Mr. Enrique Perez. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Abby. So I'll just dive right in. And I think one thing that's going to come up is that we'll be recording it and sharing it. It'll be available for folks afterwards. So you can keep that in mind. So just quickly as a starting point, the presentation will be available to participants after the webinar. One, through the recording, and two, I'll include a link in the chat once we wrap up the slide deck. I'll send it to you as a PDF as well. So if it helps you not have to keep notes and stuff, that's fine. And then, yeah, as Abby mentioned, please hold questions. We'll use the chat function once we finish the slides, if only because I think there'll be a number of things that could probably be answered as we go through the slides themselves. And I'm also mindful of time. Some people can only stay for a certain amount of portion of the session. So I want to make sure we can at least get through the slide deck prior to them perhaps having to leave. Also, please bear in mind, this is a non-exhaustive and non-personalized information. It's not meant to be personalized financial or investment advice. Everyone's situation is usually unique. And one of the things I like about my work is that everyone's a different puzzle in that way. I also want to acknowledge that this is a great deal of information, and given the time, I might be speaking quicker than I usually would like to as well. And so it's a lot to digest. That's why we also wanted to record it, and we also wanted to make sure it was available to you all after. So I just wanted to tip my hat to all of you for joining us, and off we go. So a little bit about me quickly, just in terms of road travel and destination. One, regards to financial literacy. So my parents, I'm first generation. My parents came here from Bolivia, and they didn't, know a whole lot about retirement or financial literacy. A coworker of my dad's at the factory got him to open a 401k, and in the meantime, he invested only in bonds because they were, the more conservative approach, and it was a more seasoned coworker of his who had suggested this. And so for me, even before that, the summer after high school, I ended up taking an adult ed course on like investing because I'd come across some stuff about it and it seemed interesting, and kind of a running theme throughout my career was that I was definitely the youngest person in the room in that particular adult ed course. And I ended up, because of that, kind of self-educating myself a great deal. Just started managing their retirement savings, on an informal basis for close to 20 years ago. And a lot of that came as well from a lot of self-education with some of my suite mates in a little place called Mission Park when we were in Dennett House, 4th floor. And through there, there were definitely failures and lessons learned and overcoming trials. Fortunately, that was not with my parents' retirement money. I was pretty conservative with that, but with my own babysitting money that I cobbled together in high school. And then, it was really great to have those type of experiences during the tech boom, excuse me, in the late 90s into the early 2000s, to be able to embrace those, especially one when I was doing winter study in Cuba. And there was this merger between AOL and Time Warner, if any of you know of those companies. And I wasn't able to, and the stocks started plummeting, and I couldn't do anything because I was in Cuba where they didn't really have the internet. So that was a terrific lesson learned about, which we can touch on later. Secondly, with career arc, a lot of it has been about relationships and building long-term relationships, not building burning bridges. I'm very fortunate to have great experiences, mostly in government in the beginning part of my career, right after Williams, and then grad school, where I went to Yale to get my MBA, which I felt was a very Williams-y type of program because it was so small, although nicely, in a city as well, which is a little bit different than, there was more than one traffic light, and a lot of continued self-teaching on my end as well. Some luck and pluck, luck, in terms of opportunities that were available and being at the right place at the right time. And then the pluck, I think we're all familiar with, is the hard work that it entails. And for me, it's been paying it forward with a lot of informal mentorships, even when we didn't have a distinct HR person, it was kind of me or me splitting it with our CFO and trying to work with our, younger colleagues and trying to get a sense of how we could be helpful to them. And I think with a lot of folks who, have gone to Williams, I don't think I've ever turned down an informational interview from anyone from Williams as well. So that's, kind of my little way of paying it forward. And then with clients too, I view it as a way for them to self-invest, whether it's their upcoming performance review or a new job or negotiation over a salary increase for a promotion or raise. All of that can represent cash flows that go towards their financial goals and perhaps even meeting those financial goals sooner because of that. So I feel that's why this type of stuff is very important to talk about. And at the end, for me, really, it's just about how I can continue to be a resource and share what I've learned with others. So on to financial literacy. The first part I would point out is that it's rarely taught formally. I think there's a movement now over time to perhaps formalize this, that varies state by state. But typically, it's through informal avenues. That might be through parents, it might be through snippets of things you hear from friends or from colleagues, and sometimes even self-teaching, perhaps even as a last resort. But even all of those informal avenues can be time and information constrained, right? Like your parents might not know a lot about financial literacy themselves, or they might not have enough time to relay it to you. The same can happen at work with regards to what you're picking up there. And self-teaching, you have to find the time to do it. And like parenting and cooking, there is no one official book to financial literacy or investing. I think if there were one official book, then we would all own that book. And there wouldn't be any other books out there for parenting, for cooking, and investing or financial literacy. And a lot of that, I think, is due to the fact that there's a lot of change and adaptation that occurs. Tax laws are changed, dollar amounts and rules are changed for a particular type of accounts and what you can do, et cetera. Fortunately, there's a wide-ranging number of venues where you can get information, whether it be magazines or websites, at least because magazines, because they're published currently, more than a book that might become out of date with, tax law changes, et cetera. For magazines, I usually recommend people get Kiplinger, which is a pretty good way to get an introduction to personal finance, or websites that you can poke around on, whether it's, The Balance, or Kiplinger also has a website, for example, and kind of just, exploring around and getting a sense of what's out there, which is, to your benefit. Secondly, a little bit about the financial landscape. I think it's also helpful to acknowledge it's just the landscape has changed. This isn't what your parents or your grandparents faced when it comes to finances. And it's very much a different map with different borders, and there's very little sense of the terrain. Well, but a little, visual example here. This is a map from 1861. And by this time, people have been making maps for hundreds of years. For those of you who are in Boston, if you can make your way to the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library, the Copley branch, it's a phenomenal little place that they've set up there. And so, for those of you who are familiar with Boston, here's a map of Boston, 1861. And, even this map here, you can't really tell what the terrain is, right? Are the streets paved or are they dirt? If they are paved, are they cobblestones? Are they brick? Probably not asphalt. Park Street between Tremont and Beacon is uphill, but you can't tell that on this map. You can't tell on the map also that Bowdoin Street, coming from Beacon Hill, if you head down that way, is downhill. Or even are there any paths within Boston Common? And if so, what are they? Are they also dirt, or are they paved over with anything? And so to that effect, the terrain just isn't known, right? We face student loans, a higher cost of living, rising healthcare costs for you and for your aging parents, both now and in the future, which is more unknown. And both generations are living longer. There are fewer pensions. Workers are really left to fend for themselves. Back in the day, you had organizations, especially in the private sector, that had pensions for their workers, and that's really not the case now. There are, however, more tools at your disposal, but they are more self-directed. And these additional vehicles, which we'll touch on some of them, 401ks, IRAs, or 529 accounts for college savings, for offspring. There's also the internet, which is fine and good, but sometimes there's a paradox of choice where you have too many choices, and what are you going to choose? But for sure, that does make it a lot more accessible. You no longer, say, for example, have to go to a library to be reading about this stuff. You can pull it up on your phone. And also, like your liberal arts advantage, which I'll touch on again later, but, all of you on this call are going to be analytical. I'm sure all of you are lifelong learners. You're very capable of holding two thoughts, if not more, in your head at the same time. And all of that, I think, suits you very well to be able to adapt to changes. You're able to ask why. You're able to ask then what, and if this, then that. Even for me as a history major, being taught by Professor Dalzell, he would always ask us why and push us to try to determine what occurred and why that occurred, and try to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And I think that's the type of advantage you can have when it comes to financial literacy and what steps you should take. And then we'll touch on that on the career side as well. So quickly here, just a visualization of you. It's a little thought exercise. And if you have a piece of paper nearby, great. If not, again, we'll send out the slides. But just give some thought to, how much have you saved so far? And this isn't for sharing. This is just for you. But give some thought to how much have you saved so far? How much are you saving each month for your goals, your financial goals, if you have financial goals? And what do you want your financial position to be in 10 or 20 or maybe even 40 years? So I'll just pause for a moment for you to just think about that briefly. All right, great. So we'll keep going. We'll return to these a little later as well. Because now I want to switch over to your savings options, right? That's why we're kind of all here. A lot of it comes down to what's between employer-provided options and what your personal savings options are. Your employer-provided ones are essentially defined contribution plans, and these are called, 401ks or 457bs. They're essentially named after wherever in the tax code or that they derive from. Why they can't all be called defined contribution plans, I don't know why, but 401k, it kind of just stuck, and so that's what it's called in terms of its day-to-day reference. You'll see 401ks typically more in the private sector, 457bs, for example, more in government and nonprofit. And on the personal side, there's some tax sheltered account options for retirement, like a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA that we're going to talk about, and then taxable accounts like a brokerage account and a savings account, which I think you all are probably going to be familiar with, and we'll go through those as well. So to start out with employer-provided plan options, it's typically this defined contribution plan, which is 401k, etc. And for 2020, your contribution limits are essentially $19,500. Or if you happen to be on this call and over 50, that's $26,000. Or if you have parents and you want to show them how much you learned about financial literacy this week, when you're giving them a call or reaching out to them, you can let them know that if they're over 50, they can contribute up to $26,000 to their employer-provided retirement plan. So these are pre-tax contributions from your paycheck. So if you make, say, for example, $50,000, and you want to set aside 10% of your paycheck, so $5,000, your employer will do that for you automatically. You have to opt into the plan, etc. But that $5,000 will not be taxed, right? Because they're taking it out of your paycheck before it kind of gets run through the process of sending whatever you typically owe in taxes to the IRS and such, to the U.S. Treasury. And so this reduces your gross income on your taxes. So when you're filing your taxes, instead of putting down $50,000 as your sort of your gross income, you'll end up being taxed at a $45,000 rate, right? Because if you're making 50 and you're contributing 5,000, you will only get taxed on that 45,000 for the year, without doing a huge deep dive into tax forms and what a TurboTax will give you. But that's kind of what the gist of it is. Some organizations will match your contributions, and if the organization you work at does, that's terrific news. And if sometimes they don't, that's just kind of how things work out. Perhaps in the future, you might be in an organization that does that. These match amounts can vary, right? So sometimes it can be, an organization will match up to, will match the first 50% up to, say, 6% of your salary. Some organizations will match 100% of what you're contributing. or they'll, say we'll match up to a certain dollar amount. So that can very much vary, but it's something to be mindful of if you want to participate in one of these plans at work. And then some of these matches will vest. And what that means is it's how much of the match you get to keep over time. So let's say you put in, it's your first year at work, and you put in $1,000 into one of these plans that they offer, this 401k plan. And so, you put in $1,000 and they say, yeah, we'll match you 100%, dollar for dollar. Whatever dollar you put in, we'll match you with that same dollar, which is great. But if there's a vesting element to it, they might say, the matching funds will vest over, say, 4 years. So in year one, 25% of that match is actually now going to be yours. In year two, it'll be 50%. So what they do is they try to incentivize you to stay at your employer. So if you put away $1,000 in year one, it might be, continuing that moving forward, whatever they give you as a match, if you left after 2 years, perhaps then you only get to keep 50% of that match. So the $1,000 you put in and the $1,000 they put in, if you left in year two, they put it into account, but you don't actually get to keep it if you leave after 2 years. You get to keep 50% of it because they're trying to incentivize you to stay, as an example. One way to look at matches as well is it's additional tax-free compensation. So your employer is essentially paying into your retirement account, which is what these are usually used for. One, you won't get taxed on it. And so to some extent, it's almost as though you're creating a return on your investment right out of the gate, right? So if you put in X amount of dollars and they're willing to match a portion of it, you've already made money from your investment by having just set some aside. And it's tax-free. So with withdrawals, this can start really happening at 59 and a half years of age. There is one caveat at 55, but I'm cognizant of time. But essentially, when you are making these withdrawals of both your previous contributions and your earnings over time, they will be taxed. If you're looking to make early withdrawals of any of these contributions or your earnings, there's a 10% penalty and you're taxed on it, right? Because the money you've been putting in and the earnings that you've been deriving from it in this tax sheltered account, since it hasn't been taxed yet, if you're taking it out, they will then get taxed. And the government, the way it's set up, they don't want you to be taking these funds out early. They want you to be saving for retirement. So there's then a 10% penalty that's assessed on you as well, because they do want to incentivize you to continue saving and not have to withdraw funds from these type of accounts. There are some very limited exceptions without doing a deep dive to the tax code. I think there's been some more talk about 401k loans given COVID-19 than there has been in the past. If you were ever, forced to, or in a position where you had to do this, just be mindful of the fact that when whatever you take out, you will probably have to pay interest on, and you'd be paying it back with after-tax dollars. So without doing a whole bunch of math, if you had to take out $10,000, that $10,000 you took out was $10,000 of money that had never been taxed. And now when you're repaying that 401k loan, when you're taking that money out for an emergency purpose, let's say, you're going to be paying with after-tax dollars. So the original dollar amount they end up paying will probably be significantly higher, in addition to whatever interest might be charged by your employer or the service provider who runs your 401k plan for your employer. One thing about employer-provided plans is that you have a galaxy of options, and we're going to talk about Galaxy and Universal in a little bit. But essentially, these are going to be mutual funds typically, and they'll different types that you may have seen on the menu there from your employer. Target date funds. They might mirror an index or certain indices. They might have a growth. They're geared towards growth or being conservative or trying to create income. They might have domestic holdings, like domestic stocks here in the U.S. or international stocks from places outside the US. The one thing to keep in mind here is that when you see this list, it's a galaxy of options because it's really what your employer has chosen for you to create this menu, right? There are other mutual funds out there, but you will be limited to what is provided here on this menu by your employer and by the service provider they've contracted with to run the plan. So just keep that in mind. We'll come to that in a little bit again as well as comparison. But here with employer-provided plans, you have this galaxy of options. One thing to be wary of is costs when it comes to mutual funds. Typically, it's called an expense ratio or a cost ratio. This is essentially, how much they charge to have you hold the fund, essentially, right? So, for example, a mutual fund might have a 1% expense ratio or cost ratio. And so for every $100 you put in, they're going to charge you $1 for essentially having chosen that option. You'll see higher expense ratios and cost ratios on active funds, like active mutual funds, where you'll have a manager who is, implementing their own strategy that they've come up with. And so there might be more buying and selling through the year. And so that's an active fund where they're actively managing the funds. Versus a passive fund, which you may have heard about, typically these are just funds that are trying to reflect and mirror an index out there. So if you've heard of the S&P 500 index, there are going to be a lot of passive funds that are trying to mirror the holdings and therefore the performance of that index over time. And so those funds are a lot cheaper with regards to their expense ratio and cost ratio because there isn't like a strategy they're implementing and they're not monitoring markets so much and what company the research is done to buy it or to sell it. They're really just these passive funds. They're really passive in that way, arguably, where they're really just looking to mirror an index. And for that reason, it doesn't cost as much to run them. And so the expense or cost ratio for those passive funds will be less. Typically, you can find like an S&P 500 index fund for maybe, let's say, 0.10%. So again, quick little overview for defined contribution plans. Contributions are pre-tax, right? So they're untaxed dollars from your paycheck. And here's a little purple and gold I snuck in into the arrows. There's growth over time for both your contributions and your earnings. Those are untaxed while they are in this tax-sheltered account, your 401k or 457b plan account. But your withdrawals are taxed. So over time, when you're making these withdrawals now, in the future, the contributions and earnings that you'd made pre-tax that were untaxed dollars will eventually be taxed. So now some personal options. We're going to go over the two larger ones. These are also tax sheltered accounts. The first one is a traditional IRA, sometimes referred to just simply as an IRA. So your 2020 contribution limits for this type of account is $6,000. If you're over 50 years of age, you can contribute up to $7,000 to this type of account in calendar year 2020. The one thing I'll add about IRAs is that you can also contribute, like for calendar year 2020, you actually can contribute up through April 15th of 2021, so the next year's tax deadline. And if folks have questions about that, we can do that in Q&A. But the one thing about the traditional IRA, for example, the contributions can be tax deductible, and that reduces your gross income on taxes. So again, if you were making, well, actually, I should show you the next bullet here. The tax deductibility, like whether you can, in fact, deduct your contributions from your taxes, is based on your income, especially if your employer offers a retirement plan. There are phase-out ranges. So for that purpose, so if you're, a single, your tax-paying filer status is as a single person. Let's say you make $60,000 a year, and you're putting away $6,000 a year into this traditional IRA. You can fully deduct that $6,000 on your taxes, versus if you're single but making, let's say, $80,000, you won't be able to deduct this contribution to your traditional IRA on your taxes because they start phasing it out. If you're, making $70,000 as a single filer, then you might only be able to contribute or might only be able to deduct half of what you contributed, for example. And similarly for married couples, if both spouses are looking to contribute to this account. There are higher ranges if your spouse's employer doesn't offer retirement plans, but it'd be too much in the weeds for us here. More importantly here, your contributions and your earnings grow tax-free. So it's similar to a 401k account in that way. Withdrawals, again, like a 401k account, at 59 and a half years of age, your withdrawals of your contributions that you made over time and your earnings that you've gained over time are taxed. Again, like a 401k, early withdrawals of any contributions or any earnings have a 10% penalty that are assessed on them, and they're taxed. So, it's not, the government, again, is trying to make sure and incentivize you to not take money out, since the purpose of the account, the tax advantage status they're giving is for people to actually save for retirement. So they want to incentivize that behavior. There are some exceptions. The most sort of popular one is for a first-time home purchase. You can withdraw up to $10,000 from a traditional IRA. This means you'll skip out on the penalty, but you will be taxed because, remember, the money you put in there hasn't been taxed. The one interesting thing with a traditional IRA is that you have a universe of options, right? So with a employer-provided plan like a 401k, you have the galaxy of options, right? Because they choose the menu that you can select for what your options are. Whereas a traditional IRA, you have the universe of mutual funds out there, the universe of ETFs that are out there, and the universe of individual stocks, like individual companies, for example, that are out there for you to pick. In some ways that might be a lot to take in, but you can even mirror certain things that are in your 401k plan, perhaps even in your IRA, if you want to keep things simple for yourself. So here's kind of with the arrows again, your contributions can be tax deductible. They're not always, but they can be into this traditional IRA account. The growth over time of what you've contributed and your earnings over time are untaxed while they are in this tax sheltered account. And then your withdrawals of these contributions and earnings over time are then taxed when you're then taking them out upon retirement or when you're getting closer to retirement. The second kind of big personal type of tax sheltered account is the Roth IRA. The Roth IRA, same contribution limits as a traditional IRA. The one thing, and there's a future bullet about it, but I'll bring it up here as well. If you have both a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA, because sometimes that's what makes sense for people, you can't contribute $6,000 to each of them. You can only contribute up to $6,000 between the two of them. So if you have two of these accounts, you can do like $2,000 for a traditional IRA and $4,000 to a Roth IRA, for example, but you can't do $6,000 to each. And if you're over the age of 50, you can, again, similarly to the traditional IRA, contribute up to $7,000 for calendar year 2020. The difference here with the Roth IRA is that contributions are made with post-tax dollars. So this is after you've provided your employer with your labor, and they have paid you and you've had all your taxes taken out, your health insurance premium, all that type of stuff. What lands in your checking or savings account, those are the dollars that you can then now contribute to a Roth IRA. And because it's post-tax dollars, you've already been taxed on it, you can't deduct your contributions on your taxes. Again, here there are some income-based contribution limits. So their phase-out ranges are here as provided. This is current for 2020. They typically change year to year. So for 2021, be sure to take a look at the IRS website, or poking around in the internet, you'll probably also find it yourself. And so here, so for example, if you're a single filer and you're making $120,000, you can still make a $6,000 contribution to a Roth IRA. If you're making $130,000 as a single filer, then you won't be able to make up to the $6,000 contribution limit. You'd have to go to the IRS website. There's a little calculator to help you figure out how much of your contribution is phased, right? It's not the full 6,000. It might be, let's say, I don't know, I'll make as an example, maybe it's only $5,100, for example. Withdrawals here for the Roth IRA. So again, at the magic number of 59.5 years of age, when you're making withdrawals, the earnings are not taxed. And that's what makes the Roth IRA special and different than the traditional IRA. The earnings that you've been able to capture over time in this tax shelter account, when you're taking them out, they're not taxed. Since you contributed post-tax money, the government lets all this grow over time in this tax sheltered account. So that's such that when the funds coming out of the Roth IRA are they're not taxed. There are early withdrawals on earnings. If you do that, though, again, like the traditional IRA, since they're trying to, the government's providing you with this tax advantaged account where it's sheltered over time, the 10% penalty would apply, and you would be taxed on the earnings. Keep in mind, I only said earnings here, right? We'll compare that with the traditional IRA in a moment. There are exceptions again, like again with the most popular one being the first-time home purchase up to $10,000. You will not be assessed a penalty and you won't be taxed on it. But the caveat here is that this Roth IRA, if you were to use your dip into this retirement savings for that, which ideally you don't want to do that, but if you have to, it helps you with your down payment or gets you that helps you stretch to that place that you found that you just absolutely love. The caveat here, though, is that the Roth IRA account itself has had to have been opened in existence for at least 5 years, or that you've had a Roth IRA. So if you were, say, with Wealthfront and you moved it to Schwab, as long as you'd opened a Roth IRA at Wealthfront 5 or more years ago, then you can take advantage of this particular exception. The great thing about Roth IRAs as well is that previous contributions can always be withdrawn, not getting taxed, and no matter when. Because remember, the funds that you put in there, the money you put in there had already been taxed. So the government, in this case, isn't going to tax you twice if you take out the money that you've initially put in after getting paid, and any money that you then from previous contributions take out. So that can be pretty powerful. Maybe it's sometimes people will have that as an emergency fund. Again, maybe not the best thing to do because you do really be saving these monies for retirement. But push comes to shove, or a very difficult situation, you do have funds that you've previously contributed. This can be accessed for that particular potential type of emergency. Again, with a Roth IRA, like a traditional IRA, you have this universe of options out there with all the mutual funds that are out there, ETFs, and individual stocks of individual companies. One caveat I'll put in here, we're seeing more employers offer this, is a Roth 401k. I won't spend too much time on it because I don't want to be too confusing here. It's similar to a 401k because the Roth 401k will be provided by your employer. It's not a personal tax sheltered account. You will again have a galaxy of options like the mutual funds that your employer provides for you and picks for you. For 2020, the contribution limits is $19,500. If you have a 401k at work and this Roth 401k option, you can't contribute $19,500 to each of them. Like that's the cap. You can contribute, say, $9,000 to one and $10,500 to another between your 401k plan and your Roth 401k plan if your employer provides it. So that's the next bullet there. But again, you have the galaxy of options there. I think the last I read, only like 8% of employers offer this. So this might not be occurring, but I think more and more companies are starting to do this over time. So again with the arrow, so contributions to a Roth to a Roth IRA, for example, are made with post-tax dollars. And so then the growth over time in this tax sheltered account of both your contributions and earnings are untaxed while they're in there, and such that your withdrawals are then untaxed, right? They're not going to be taxed again. So quickly, again, with personal tax sheltered accounts, which we've just gone over, there's no taxation on gains and no tax deduction on losses while you have money in these accounts, which is pretty powerful. So, to the extent that you have gains over time and you might decide to sell one mutual fund for another, if it were in a regular taxable account, you would get taxed on those gains. But in these tax sheltered accounts, when you make those moves, there is no taxation that occurs on any gains. But the flip side also is if you happen to have a loss on something you've selected, like a mutual fund in your 401k or traditional IRA or Roth IRA, there is no deduction on any losses that you may have incurred. So given your income, one thing to think about is just which accounts do you qualify for? And again, I mentioned this previously, but the contribution limits of $6,000 a year are across both the traditional IRA and Roth IRA. You can't do $6,000 to each. Keep in mind, of course, that no matter the vehicle you choose, your dollars are eventually taxed, right? If you're contributing to a 401k or traditional IRA, you don't get taxed up front, but you get taxed on the back end. And with a Roth IRA, you get taxed up front, but you don't get taxed on the back end. So you have a choice as to when your money is taxed. Is it now versus later? So a quick thought experiment to inform your decision-making, not for now, but for later, is, if you're going to earn less money in retirement because you're no longer working, do you think income tax rates will be higher for you now versus later? And here's a quick little table to help you out kind of navigating all this, because I know that was a lot of information. I think this can be something to quickly refer to and then go back to bullets as needed. So I hope that's of use. And again, kind of a visual illustration, because I'm definitely a visual learner. The galaxy versus universe that I keep bringing up is, for example, in your 401k or employer provided plans, you have this menu of choices that your employer chooses for you. So you have a galaxy of choices, which is helpful that they've been kind enough to curate for you. That's just one galaxy, versus in a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA, you have the universe, right? You have ETFs that you can choose from. You have stocks, like individual companies you can choose from. And here in the mutual fund side, right? It's great that your company might be choosing a number of mutual funds for you, but there are a plethora of other mutual funds that are out there for you as well to choose from, which you can't do in your 401k plan, but you could in a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. So quickly, with personal accounts that are taxable, so a brokerage account, so if you wanted to open something at, say, Charles Schwab or TD Ameritrade, et cetera, these are post-tax dollars that you'd be contributing to it, and there's no limit to it. And you can put it towards this universe of options that are out there. Taxation is dependent on income levels and the length of ownership. So if you buy like a mutual fund or a stock and you hold it for more than a year, you're going to be taxed on differently than if you had it for less than a year. And if you had, if you bought something and held it for more than a year, and there's something else you bought and held for less than a year that had a loss, you can't use the two to offset them. But if you have two different things that you bought and held for more than a year, one has a gain, one has a loss, one went up $1,000, one went down $500, your total gain would be $500 because you can use those type of long-term gains and losses to offset each other, which we can get into a little more detail if needed. If you own something that provides dividends, those dividends can be taxed. For savings account, I think this is something most of us will be familiar with. These are post-tax dollars. There's no limit to what you can put into account typically, and it's kept in cash. They're seen as risk-free because if the bank you're putting these funds in, and the bank closes for some reason or goes out of business, the US government will insure up to $250,000 worth of what you had at that bank. You're probably seeing high yield savings account options at online banks. Bank of America probably might have a 0.10% interest rate, whereas say Ally or Marcus by Goldman Sachs will have 0.60% because they have lower overhead. It's an online only bank. And these savings accounts can be good for shorter term goals, right? Your emergency fund or savings for a down payment. And one thing here to keep in mind, while it is a personal type of savings vehicle, it is taxable, right? The interest you earn can be taxed. One thing to keep in mind for any financial goals, like a framework that you can apply towards it, is just giving thought to what's your risk tolerance, right? What level of risk are you comfortable with? One thing I ask clients a lot is, giving thought to not how will you react, but how have you reacted? So when there was a bit of a shake of the stock market earlier this year because of COVID, how did you react? Did you sell your holdings? Or did you, if you have a 401k plan, did you continue making your biweekly contributions? I like to ask people how they in fact react versus how they will react, because humans can be very overconfident and want to say, oh no, here's what I would do. But in fact, they may not actually do that when the rubber hits the road. With the great financial crisis in the late 2008, 2009, the stock market went down for about 18 months. And that's a long time to have the wherewithal to not react to that. Also, just as importantly, with regards to your risk tolerance, is your time horizon. Like, is it a short-term time horizon? So that might be for your emergency fund or your vacation fund. Medium term might be for your down payment or any family-related type of expenses, whether it's extended family or if you're looking to start a family on your own. And long-term, right? Your time horizon for retirement is a long-term time horizon, or if you're trying to create enough wealth where you want to perhaps pass them along to offspring or others, or leave it a charity that can continue working over time, could be intergenerational. So typically what you'll see for shorter term time horizons for a particular financial goal, you probably want to have a low risk towards what your money is being put towards. For longer term stuff, if the market goes down, but your retirement's not for 30 or 40 years, you might be willing to invest in some more riskier assets such as stocks because of that, because there's a good probability that it will still continue to go up over time in the long term. So some thoughts to consider, and I want to be mindful of time. Don't spend more than you can earn is essentially what it comes down to. Lifestyle creep is to be managed, and percentages can matter. So for example, if you need a new car, give thought to what type of car you actually need, or what expense you might be taking on, and how much of it, it's sort of the classic need versus want question to ask yourself. And percentages matter in the sense that, if you get a 10% raise for a promotion or what have you, the additional funds that are coming in, how much of that are you going to continue to save, or will you be spending it all now that you have more money coming in? And giving thought to, if you're saving X amount, I'll use a round number, saving 20% of your salary, maybe you want to make sure you're continuing to do that even as your salary goes up. Budgeting can be very important to help see this visually for yourself, whether it's informal in a spreadsheet or formally through apps like Mint or You Need a Budget. Investing is simple, but it is not easy. So, you can come up with some sort of guidelines for yourself that can keep it simple, but it's definitely not easy to continue to, maintain a steady state. So for example, with the coronavirus starting earlier this year and the market's going down, for me, for example, and my stomach was in knots and my jaw was very tight, but my mind was clear, which is not easy, right? Mind is clear because the investing is simple. We have plans with clients and things of that nature, but it's not easy because you still have to stomach it. I don't know who to attribute this to, but I thought it was a great quote in that long-term financial stability is the ultimate delayed gratification system. So yeah, it might be easier to spend your hard-earned money on certain things now, but give thought to how that impacts you in the future. But you don't get the gratification of those expenditures until the future, right? If you're saving for retirement, you can't really see retirement for quite some time. So that makes it very much a delayed gratification. Success is in investing, so what you're doing through your retirement accounts, for example, is only attainable and sustainably maintained over the long term. Like if you don't have a long-term focus for this stuff, it's really hard to, you might spend more time trying to trade in and out of things rather than focus on the fact that the funds are going to be used in the long term. Compounding is the greatest wealth creator over time. You've probably seen this in earlier examples of savings accounts when they actually had decent interest rates, where the money you earn from interest then earns interest onto itself. And the same can be said for other avenues for investing, where if you have a particular gain in one year, the next year it's kind of where you're starting out from. I even say this with clients with regards to their salary negotiations. They're getting you a job. If you get a job offer, it's because they want you. It's okay to ask for another 5%, because if you get that extra 5% in that salary negotiation, next year's raise is built off of that higher number. And so you already get to compound off of that. And also less focus on trying to be smart and more focus on not being stupid. Don't try to be clever. I think this also means, to the extent that most businesses, like if you're investing in individual stocks, most of them over time do go out of business. So, even if 20% of them will continue and will be around in the next 30 years, you also then don't want to be picking, say, the 80% of them that won't be around. Focusing on making sure you're not making a bad investment in that regard is just as important. Some traits to avoid: believing you can time the market. So if you sell at what you think is the top and then things go down, hey, great, but when are you going to reinvest? When will you take that cash and reinvest those funds in the market? You won't be able to know. You might think you do, but you don't actually know when the market may have hit its low point. What's more important is that the amount of time you spend in the market. So the amount of time that you are invested and continue your biweekly contributions and such is typically what will matter more. If you hear a stock tip and immediately want to invest in it, when Nintendo comes out with a new Switch console and it goes up 50% a month because there's a lot of great news about it and there's a lot of people buying it, doesn't necessarily mean you want to invest in it right away. I mean, in that example, I remember it went up 50% at one point, this a couple years ago, and then within about a month or so, it was kind of back to where it was. So just because a company might be hot doesn't mean you necessarily should immediately want to invest in it. That another trait to avoid: wanting or expecting smooth performance returns. If you look in the chart of the stock market, it might go up 10% one year, it might go down 2% one year, etc. It can go up and down over time. It will not go up 5% every single year, so you can't expect that. Over time, that might average out to something like that, but on a yearly basis, that's not to be expected. I would recommend not checking your portfolio every week or every day. That's just a lot of noise. Don't think that long-term means 6 months to a year. Or think that investing is easy, kind of to the earlier quote. So your decision when it comes to your investments, really, I think Carl Richards in the New York Times with his napkin drawings did this quite nicely. You get to decide which to focus on. Is it the days you focus on, where there's typically more volatility, or the decades over time when it comes to, for example, your retirement savings? With the decades, I probably add some squiggles here and there, but I think the point is made that he's trying to show that over time it is a lot smoother than the days. So if you focus on the days, you probably have more stressful days when it comes to thinking about your retirement savings and your other savings. But if you focus on the decades or the longer term, you will be able to sleep a little more soundly at night. So quickly, just to revisit this, something to think about, the thought questions. So instead of how much have you saved so far, just give some thought to moving forward. How much do you want to be saving? How much will you save for each month for your goals? And what will your financial position be in 10 to 20 or 40 years from now? You don't have to do that now, but just something to be mindful of moving forward. So think of it as also building a house, right? You want to invest in and lay the foundation first. You want to build a house after the fact, after you've laid out this foundation. So if you're saving now, the funds that are here can compound, then you can start adding the walls and the roof and the interior and such, and building wings and additions to this house. For those of you, for example, with team sports, giving thought to the fundamentals of the sports that you learned. How much do you want to be saving? Typically a good rule of thumb is 10 to 15% of your gross income of savings, at least for your retirement income. So if you can get that fundamental to start, that's great. I took woodworking throughout all of high school. So for me, I like to think of it as measuring twice and cutting once with regards to how to approach all this. Quickly on career arc, I know I want to be mindful of time. Investing in your career, seizing and capitalizing on opportunities, try to solve problems for your supervisor. It's typically a great way to be noticed by your supervisor, not be lost in the kind of the day-to-day. And be mindful of that. If someone's asking for a volunteer for something, if you can keep it on your plate, then go ahead and do it. Assessing the probabilities on progression and promotions. So this is, if you feel as though that you have a shot at a promotion, what probability would you assign to it? Is it in fact a decent shot at it? I'll let you look up Occam's razor in the future. Seek feedback from everyone, both people you work for, people who are colleagues that you work on with projects on, for everyone, and do it often and say thank you. There might be some things that you might not want to hear, but it's better to hear them earlier in your career and nip what could potentially become bad habits, nipping them in the bud, rather than when it gets harder to do so as you progress in your career. And try to find some mentors who might be able to do this as well. Networking and information interviews, I strongly suggest you try to do these while you were employed. Doing this when you're looking for a job is very hard. You can lay down the framework and the foundation for yourself for any future job search while you're employed, and it's a lot easier to do so. I think with regards to range of experience, if you're looking to switch an industry, for example, try to find someone who's a few years ahead of you or has done the transition themselves a few years prior. You can ask them the basic questions. Whereas it's a little harder and not the best use of the time, perhaps, to be asking basic questions to someone who might be more seasoned and has been in the workforce for a long time or has had a longer career. Take care of the basic questions with people who are a few years out versus, you can then be able to have more substantive questions for the people who, might be the ones who'd be hiring you if they're more seasoned. On day one of any new role, give thought to what's your next role, and not to dissuade you from focusing on your new role. Like, congratulations, it's a new role, but you've done this before, right? As a first year in high school or even sophomore year and such, you're probably thinking about, college. And all right, so what courses should I be taking? What extracurriculars should I be doing? What should I be doing now that can help me think about and progress to the next step for whatever that next role might be? For leadership, this comes down to a lot of studying. Like, I was in the public sector for a long time earlier in my career, and I would read Business Week and Fortune from the private, focuses on private sector to see a lot of what was going on there. Observing it, you'll learn a lot from your good bosses. You'll probably learn even more from your bad bosses. I remember instances where I would think to myself, gosh, I don't like how they're doing this. And neither do my coworkers, I would notice, didn't like it either. And I thought, all right, well, at some point when I get to manage, I'm gonna make sure not to be in this particular situation, whether it's, providing feedback publicly in front of a group of people, for example. That all being said, when it comes to leadership, 70% of it is experiential, 30% of it is what you might study. So giving thought to, if you can volunteer for stuff where you can kind of build your leadership chops, is to your benefit. And schedule time to think. It's so hard to do this as it is, but it's to your benefit, whether it's your, your finances, your career, your own personal life. It's hard to find time to actually think about these things. So if you schedule time to do it, you will actually be able then to focus on doing so. Quickly with resume and LinkedIn, keep 2 resumes. One's a laundry list of just things you've been doing and getting done, which is helpful. And then that way you can pare it down whenever you need to for a working draft. So if you need to just search for a job, you already have a working draft in play. You don't have to think of, oh, 2 years ago, I worked in this project and here were the results. I can't remember it. You can also use this laundry list as part of your performance review, right? So it'll be helpful to be bringing it up with stuff you have with your supervisor. Be mindful of listing your accomplishments versus just regurgitating your job description on a resume. I see this a lot when I was a hiring manager. And so, your accomplishments are going to be what help you stand out. And quantify, quantify, quantify. If you manage a small team on a project or manage people at your job, don't just say you managed a team. Say you managed 3 people or 5 people or whatnot. If you created efficiencies in a process, what was the metric you used that you can demonstrate that? So few people quantify, so that way, if you do quantify in your resume, you'll stand out that much more. For your LinkedIn profile, quickly, just claim your unique URL. So it can be, linkedin.com/in/your name, even if you have to use a period or something that just is close enough to you, for example. There are these massive rumors that there might be a future WA event about mastering your online professional profile, which we can go over, how to boost your presence, optimize a profile, get noticed by recruiters, etc. And finally, your Ephvantage. We touched on this a little bit earlier, like, the liberal arts. And I think with career stuff, your network, whether it's ETHLink, using LinkedIn, using the ETHs in Boston group that was recently created. And again, all the stuff we touched on earlier about being analytical, a lifelong learner, adapting to changes, and being able to ask good questions to help you give thought to how you want to apply yourself. And so, again, from Carl Richards, the nice illustration, you might have heard this before, but what you should focus on are the things that matter and things that you can control. So you can't control the economy, you can't control the job market, but you can control what choices you make for your investments, what choices you make for how much to save, what choices you make about how you comport yourself at your job. So whenever you can find the things that both matter and the things you can control, when they overlap and you focus on that, that is the best use of your time and your efforts. Quick shameless plug, thanks to the WBA. I tell my clients they're the CEO of themselves and I'm just the finance chair of their personal board of directors. I'm a registered investment advisor. Here's what that means. I'd also do a lot of career advisement and coaching for clients. Feel free to subscribe to the social media channels. I also have a newsletter where you increase your financial and career knowledge. I'll try to share something like once a week on social media. The newsletter is just once a month. And something, if you want to do some further reading on investing, I wrote a message to clients in mid-March when things were kind of blowing up in the stock market. And I subsequently published it on LinkedIn. So if you want the article, it's there embedded. And just thank you. Really appreciate you all listening and taking the time to be here. Quickly, the appendix, due to my lawyers, financial instruments involve risk. This is not a contract. Even though I'm a registered investment advisor, doesn't mean that I am, endorsed by the SEC or my state regulator, etc. Here's my contact info as well. So if you have any follow-up questions by email, feel free to reach out by email. My LinkedIn link, feel free to connect via LinkedIn. If any of you have any interest in talking more about your personal finances or some career stuff as well, there's a link for a free discovery call. Please feel free to use it. And then in the chat now, if you want the presentation emailed to you, if you go to this Google form I quickly put together, click on that. It just asks for your name and your email address. I will not put you on any lists for any newsletters of mine or anything else. I will not put you on the Amherst College admissions distribution list either as a joke or anything. It's purely to send you the PDF of this presentation. And so with that, again, thank you. And we can open up to Q&A for those who have some time to do so. And so Abby, I'll turn it back to you. Oh, in terms of, if you have questions, please use the chat to me privately. So one question about 401k accounts versus a personal taxable account. So given that 401k earnings are taxed at a personal income rate instead of a capital gains rate, does it make sense to promote more aggressive funds like stocks in a personal taxable account and put conservative funds into a 401k account? So I think this would require like a little more zooming out in terms of your personal situation. I guess the one thing to keep in mind is, yes, like your 401k earnings, when you take them out in the future, closer for retirement, will be taxed to your personal income tax rate. That kind of depends on where your personal income tax rate is, right? So for example, this depends on how much you make. I think for a single filer this year, if you're making less than $40,000 a year, a long-term capital tax gains rate is 0%. If you're in a household of two people, then it's, I believe, 15%, which might be lower than your personal the capital gains rate of being 15%. So, I mean, I think it can be a best practice, especially if these are retirement savings. I mean, one thing to also be mindful of is your age, which I don't know, and not needing to know here either. But typically you probably want to put more riskier assets like stocks in your retirement accounts because you have time to recoup any gains or any losses, I should say. Sorry, I've been talking for a while. Bonds can also have a place in your 401k account, because if stocks aren't doing well, bonds might be doing well, and you can rebalance. From a taxation perspective, sometimes bonds can also be better in a taxable account because they might not be taxed, depending, again, though, on the type of bond that you have. So that might make it a little more personalized in that way. If you wanted to reach out or have a quick conversation about kind of your situation, I'm happy to have an informal conversation in that way. But thank you for the question. Very, very detailed. So here next, we have, how does investing in index funds relate to all of this? I've heard the term a lot before, but don't know what it really means. So investing in index funds essentially is, there are a lot of ETFs or mutual funds that are out there. And so an index fund is, let's take the S&P 500 index, for example. That is, 500 stocks that are owned, or there's an index comprised by, with 500 stocks that are picked by the nice people at Standard & Poor's. And so an index fund will simply try to mirror what the index is doing. So with the 500 stocks that are owned, the 500 stocks that are represented in the S&P 500 index fund, the 500 stocks that are represented in the S&P 500 index, an index fund will try to replicate the performance of that. So they'll own the same 500 stocks that are in the index. And within the index, different stocks are owned at different varying levels. There might be some more of one stock than another. And so in the index fund, they're going to try to replicate that. And so that's just, it's a particular type of fund. So when you hear, investing in index funds, it's typically you're trying to replicate the market to some extent, whether it's through, let's say, the S&P 500 index. There are a number of other indices. Sometimes they can be for smaller companies or mid-sized companies. The S&P 500 index is more of a larger company type of index and tracking those type of stocks. So I hope that helps in terms of how that relates. I mean, investing in index funds is essentially, you get to make those decisions about what you're investing in. And if you're investing in index funds, it's because they are mirroring and replicating the indexes that are out there that have been created by, Standard & Poor's, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is another one, for example, et cetera. One question, a spouse and I are civil servants with pensions. One has a deferred comp plan with a TSP through the government. Do you need a Roth account, or is there something else we should be doing? Yeah, and happy to schedule a discovery call. I think is something you also mentioned there. I think that might be best. It's always a question. I don't think anyone needs a Roth account. I think it's a matter of like what tools are available to you, and does it make sense to select that tool and use that tool? And so with that, in regards to that, it's also a matter of, how close you are to retirement. If you're still earning income, then yes, you can open a Roth account and be contributing to it. If you perhaps are not, then you wouldn't be able to contribute to it, as an example. But yeah, happy to chat more, once we send out the link and online. And thank you for the question. Advice heard. So I think I'll go with a shorter one here first. It's about how to strategize medium-term goals. It's a combination of investing and a savings account, or just investing. I think this is both. Again, it's without knowing your full picture. But I guess what I would say to this is, I guess it depends on what's your medium term, right? Is it 5 years or 10 years? And what is the actual goal? Is it for a down payment? Is it for, a once in a lifetime vacation? Arguably you might need more fun. You might need funds for home ownership versus trip of a lifetime. A trip of a lifetime would be fantastic, but if it couldn't happen, then how would you feel about that? So this comes down to the aggressiveness or the riskiness, again, to your question about the fund. So if it's money you can't afford to lose, then you're probably better off having it in cash in a savings account, or another type of maybe conservative bond fund, perhaps. But if it's medium term and you're okay with some fluctuations between when you start saving and when the medium term is, whether that's 5 or 10 years, it could be a combination of the two, for sure. Or it could be a combination of stocks and bonds, but knowing that there might be some volatility. So perhaps, it's kind of like retirement, right? But a shorter timeline. You start with some riskier assets and some less risky assets as part of your mix. And as you get closer to that goal, that timeline, like 5 years or 10 years, if it's a 10-year goal and you're at year 8, then you probably are, now those funds are a little more conservatively held versus more risky, held in more risky assets. Another question was contributing to your, say, a 401k, for example, to get the employer match and then invest in the market separately. Doesn't make sense. I think it'd be better to save with pre-tax dollars, as I assume most people would be taking less income when they retire. I think this really depends on how much you're able to save. If you have an employer match, to the extent that you can maximize the match is usually a very solid bet, because then you're getting free money from your employer right out of the gate and it's tax-free. You can also, but again, the trade-off is you're limited to their option of menus that they choose for you. So you won't be able to, for example, invest in individual stocks in a 401k plan than you can with an outside account that is a personal account. The savings with pre-tax dollars can depend on your income as well. So with a 401k, for example, if you can save up to, for example, the $19,500, then that reduces your income by that much, which is pretty powerful and can maybe even brings you down from one tax bracket to another. Excuse me. With regards to how much people might then be taking out with retirement, some people do have a less need for income in retirement. And so to that extent, if you're able to save in a taxable brokerage account and you're adding to it and not doing a lot of selling or overtiming it and getting the tax hit, then the longer term capital gains rate could be in your favor for those sales, those long-term capital gains that you make versus what you would withdraw from your 401k and get taxed at your normal income tax rate. However, that also depends on your income, right? So that's a little more based on what your general income might be over time, and also what tax rates might be over time. We sadly can't predict the future. We can plan for it. So sometimes it's a mix and not just one over the other. How often do you recommend rebalancing your 401k? That can vary. I wouldn't do it anything like monthly. It can be maybe quarterly or annually. I think that kind of depends on also, I think you should, figure out what your contribution should be, and hopefully that's on autopilot. Some plans allow you to rebalance automatically on a particular timetable, like quarterly or annually. If they don't do that, then you have to go do it manually, which, is perhaps humorously a first world problem. But in that case, I think it's what you're comfortable with. Perhaps quarterly or perhaps annually. If you're doing it quarterly, but you've noticed your allocation is moved by just 1%, you might not need to do it. But if it moves anything more like, let's say 5%, so instead of, I'll use a random example, instead of 70% stocks and 30% bonds, if it's shifted more than 5%, then it might make some sense to rebalance back to your original allocation. Let's see. And I think what might be the last question is, if I'm happy to stay on a little longer, I can stay till probably about 1:15 or so. Advice for people paying student loans. Gosh, that is, I could probably, that might be another presentation, right? For paying student loans, it's interesting. I'm doing a debt-related presentation for MBAs next Wednesday. And so I think the thought here is, it depends on what type of student loan. Is it college debt? Is it grad school debt? One thing to keep, if it's with federal money, there are a variety of payback options. It can be income-based. If you wanted to refinance, you could probably do that with a private vendor such as SoFi, or some banks are now offering refinancing that's available to graduates. But there might be some trade-offs. Like some places allow you to go into forbearance, which means you pause your payments, but your interest still accumulates because of a job loss or et cetera. But some places don't, or you have to keep an account with them with a minimum account balance that you might not otherwise. And so there are trade-offs there. I think, but kind of zooming out more generally for paying off student loans, I think if you can refinance to a lower interest rate, that is to your benefit. And if you can spread out the payments over a longer term of time, that is also to your benefit. Especially with interest rates being at historically low numbers right now. I think to the extent that any debt you have that you can refinance and lock in lower rates at fixed rates is, again, to your benefit. Again, it's very much a unique situation for people based on what they may be making now. There are other financial obligations as well, but happy to chat about student loans if you want just a quick download and sharing what your situation is. But generally, if you can refinance at a lower rate than what you're paying, that can be beneficial to you. If you can extend the term at a low rate, then that's a benefit to you as well. Debt, especially, it actually goes to the presentation I'm doing next week. Debt can vary. It can be both emotional and rational, and it's hard to be able to balance the two sometimes. I'm someone who never liked debt at all and never wanted to have any, and here I am with a mini mortgage because I went and got my MBA. But I now take more rational perspective on it, and fortunately been able to lock in a 15-year loan for grad school that I'm repaying after refinancing at a very low rate. And so even though it's a large dollar amount, I do know that by refinancing, I lowered my monthly payments. And so that money can now be applied towards living expenses or savings. And that freed up some cash flow for me. So I think with student loans, pay off what you can. There are some benefits to prepayment, perhaps, but I think that depends on your particular situation and what the interest rate might be. Sometimes it might actually make more sense to be saving and investing than actually paying off your loan in advance. But that's, I think a particular that can be unique to people's situations, and a real conversation is probably best for that, rather than just general advice. So to the person who asked the question about student loans, feel free to reach out, and happy to chat a little bit more. Otherwise, I'm trying to find my cursor to scroll down. Yep. So it looks as though those are our questions. Thanks so much for sticking it out. For those of you who are still on, I know we went way over time. I timed this at about a half hour of my own, but I guess it took a little longer this time. But I appreciate all of you being here. I know the WBA does as well. Abby says she's having some problems with a mic. So again, if you filled out the form at the top of the chat, I'll be happy to email this to you as a PDF. And I know Abby and the WBA will be looking to post the recording online at some point. We'll go from there. Otherwise, my best to all of you, and enjoy your weekends. And hopefully we'll see you at a future WBA event.